The heavens opened without warning, releasing sheets of water that seemed intent on erasing the small depot from existence. An endless veil of gray merged earth and sky into seamless monotony. The wooden planks under the shallow shelter glistened with moisture, water pooling in grooves carved by countless footsteps, cartwheels, and the anxious shuffling of travelers awaiting locomotives that arrived behind schedule and departed too hastily. Vapor from the departing locomotive lingered in the saturated atmosphere, hovering close to the ground as if reluctant to dissipate. There, under the leaking overhang, two youngsters huddled side by side, their hair darkened by dampness. Their expressions far too serious for one so young. Emma Hartwell's plate stuck to her face, moisture trailing down her sun-spotted skin as she observed the metal beast pulling away. Though merely 10 years of age, her stare held gravity beyond her years. Next to her stood Daniel, matching her in age but contrasting in disposition, his fists buried deep in his pockets, his expression rigid, as though existence had already presented him with adversaries to resist. Their father's cart waited near the wooden barrier. The mule shifted with impatience, its tail swatting at the drizzle. Yet neither child registered the animal or the mud thickening beneath their shoes. The locomotive had left behind something more unsettling than its resonance. A woman stood isolated at the platform's distant edge, drenched completely, a modest parcel pressed firmly to her breast. Her garment, once meticulously sewn by distant hands, now clung to her slight frame soft azure, darkened by rain, the lower edge stained with earth. The umbrella she'd brought lay discarded in the mire, its frame bent, its fabric drooping like a wounded bird's wing, her face tilted downward. Yet the contour of her features and the glimmer of her ebony eyes beneath wet strands revealed origins that marked her as foreign here. Murmurs had already commenced before the engine's roar faded from hearing. A bride sent by post, people muttered. An arranged promise dispatched across waters and continents. Her identity inscribed on parchment. Her destiny bound to the whims of a stranger she'd never encountered. Marcus Brennan had arrived for her with arrogance, standing tall before the community. Then upon seeing her disembark from the carriage, her diminutive stature, her foreignness, he had grimaced, spat, and turned his back. He abandoned her standing in precipitation that fell like mockery. By the time the locomotive departed again, she had been forsaken twice, once by the homeland that birthed her, and once by the stranger meant to receive her. Emma noticed her first, tugging at Daniel's sleeve. The girl's voice carried soft, yet firm conviction as she observed. She appears lost, as if awaiting someone who won't arrive. Daniel frowned, hesitant to voice identical thoughts, yet his gaze remained fixed on the figure. Something in her posture, shoulders drawn inward as though the world pressed to. Heavily against Hurst, a protective impulse he couldn't identify. Their father, Jonathan Hartwell, had been inside the depot master's quarters, organizing provisions and speaking sparingly, as was his nature. At 40 years, Jonathan wore silence like a familiar garment. His palms bore calluses that never softened. His eyes bore creases carved deeper than time warranted. Folk claimed he had once laughed freely before illness claimed his wife 7 winters past. Since then, he had become someone of scarce words and scarcer smiles. When he emerged, his coat drawn close against the rain, his children didn't glance toward the cart or the homeward road. They looked instead at her. Emma, fearless in her innocence, slipped her small hand into her father's and lifted her face upward. Her plate dripped against his coat as she asked, without hesitation, "Could she be our mother?" The question pierced Jonathan like a blade drawn slowly. For a moment he couldn't respond, couldn't even inhale. His attention followed hers, and he observed the woman's sorrow, though he didn't yet know her name standing, as if each droplet were another stone cast upon her. Something within his chest shifted. An ache ancient as grief, yet sharp as fresh sorrow. He recalled the children's mother, her voice calming tempests at this very depot when Emma and Daniel stood no higher than the counter. He remembered her burial site on the hillside, rain carving channels through the soil as though the ground itself mourned. Daniel's voice joined his sister's, quieter, almost embarrassed by the hope it carried. Perhaps she could be. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He said nothing, merely stared at the woman, at her bundle, perhaps all she possessed in this vast and indifferent territory. The townspeople nearby shifted, whispered Mrs. Whitmore, wrapped tightly in her wrap, hissed sharply to another woman, her eyes darting toward him with disapproval, keen as needles. He understood their thoughts. A landowner's obligation was to maintain his position, preserve his dignity, not tarnish it with compassion for a forsaken stranger. Yet his children's eyes, wide and expectant, pierced through the burden of gossip, heavier than the rain. He stepped forward. Each boot sank into mud, yet his stride remained steady, purposeful. The woman raised her face as he approached, and in her gaze was not supplication but quiet resignation, as if she anticipated rejection to be her sole companion here. Her lips separated, yet no sound emerged. She merely inclined her head, a gesture holding both dignity and defeat. Jonathan cleared his throat, words forming slowly. "You'll perish from exposure out here. I have a cart. Protection, at minimum, until the weather clears." His voice was rough, as though dragged across gravel, yet it carried no condemnation. Sora blinked, startled, perhaps not by his words but by their absence of cruelty. Her hands tightened around the parcel, and for the first time she lifted her eyes fully to his. They were dark, unfathomable, yet illuminated with a glimmer speaking of endurance. She inclined her head once, a silent acceptance. The whispers behind him rose like wind through brittle grass. He's accepting her. Heaven help us, the man's lost his senses. His children will mature with disgrace on their shoulders. Heard them all, each word striking his pride like hailstones. Yet he didn't falter. Emma skipped ahead, her face bright despite the rain, and reached for the woman's free hand. "You can sit beside me in the cart," she said simply, as though the world had already rewritten itself to accommodate this new reality. Daniel followed more slowly, eyes cautious. Yet when the woman glanced down at him, offering the faintest smile, he nodded stiffly and permitted her presence. Jonathan led them to the cart, the mule protesting at the added burden, hooves shifting in resistance against the mire. He lifted her parcel gently, placing it near the children, then offered a hand to help her climb up. Her fingers were small, cold, yet steady in his grasp. The moment lingered, an unspoken oath forming in silence fragile, yet undeniable. They departed down the muddy road, the wheels groaning against saturated earth. The rain softened to drizzle, yet the sky remained heavy, as though observing. Jonathan held the reins with one hand, his other resting against the wood of the seat, fingers curled. Restless, he could sense the children pressing close to the woman, already weaving her into their small circle as though she had always existed there. He didn't know her history, didn't know her name, yet he knew already that the community would not forgive this choice easily. The road stretched long, fields bending under rain, fences leaning like weary guardians. He considered the work awaiting at the homestead, the livestock restless in their enclosures, the endless demands of spring cultivation. Yet beneath all that practical burden lay something heavier, the children's question echoing in his mind. Could she be our mother? He understood the answer couldn't be given hastily. He understood also that the world would not permit such a union without scorn. Yet when Emma leaned against the woman's arm, smiling upward, as if she had already discovered her answer, Jonathan felt the stirring of something dangerous and tender, a hope he had long interred. As the cart creaked toward home, the rain tapered off, leaving only the dripping of eaves and the hush of wet earth breathing again. Yet as the cart rattled into the yard, the last of the daylight broke through the clouds, casting a narrow beam across the saturated earth. It fell upon her face, illuminating the exhaustion, the bruised dignity, the quiet strength that marked her not as broken, but as enduring. Jonathan looked away quickly, ashamed of how much it unsettled him. Yet the thought lingered, dangerous and unshakable. He had brought her here not out of choice alone, but because his children's voices had already spoken the truth he dared not admit in the hush of the moment. With dusk pressing close and the scent of rain heavy in the air, he understood the first spark of the conflict that would define them all. The community would see this as scandal, the minister as transgression, the neighbors as weakness. Yet his children, wide-eyed and unyielding, would see only a mother. The storm beyond their land was approaching, and he had just opened the door to it. The morning after the tempest broke clear, yet the atmosphere was heavy with a kind of silence that carried whispers farther than shouts. Mist clung low across the pasture, silver threads rising off wet grass, and the Hartwell homestead seemed caught between two worlds, one washed clean by rain, the other waiting to muddy itself again with talk. Jonathan rose before the children, as he always did, his boots soft against the worn planks of the dwelling floor. He stepped outside with the ache of chores pressing on his shoulders, but also with a new burden, the knowledge that inside his home, beneath his roof, a stranger slept. Not merely a stranger, but one the entire community had already judged. When he returned carrying kindling slick with dew, he discovered her awake. She sat near the stove with the children pressed close, their hair still mussed from sleep. She had started a fire, coaxing flame from damp wood as though she had been born to it. Emma was showing her a doll with one button eye, chattering about its name while Daniel sat quieter, watching her with the cautious loyalty of a boy trying to decide if he trusted what his heart already wanted. The sight disarmed Jonathan in a way he didn't expect. For a moment, the dwelling looked different, as though softened, alive again. It unsettled him, and he busied himself with splitting wood, the rhythm sharp against the tender quiet. When he turned back, the woman Sora, he would soon learn, was looking at him, not with fear, but with the solemnity of someone waiting to understand what place, if any, she had here. He cleared his throat. The words rough. You don't owe us labor. You'll rest until you decide where you'll go next. She dipped her head, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was soft, shaped by an accent that turned English into something more careful, more deliberate. Work keeps sorrow away. I will help. The children accepted her answer without question. Emma beamed and pressed the doll into her hand as if sealing the decision. Daniel gave a small nod that meant more than words. Jonathan only grunted, yet his silence wasn't disagreement. As the days turned, the settlement began to talk louder. At the general store, Jonathan heard it in the strained politeness of greetings that ended too quickly. At the churchyard, he felt it in the way shoulders shifted, creating space where none was needed. Mrs. Whitmore, who lived 2 miles south, let her opinions ride the wind. It isn't proper for a man to bring foreign disgrace under his roof. Children will pay the price. Mark my words. Reverend Patterson stopped by one evening, his horse tethered near the fence, his hat in his hands as he stood in the doorway. He was someone who weighed words before speaking, his sermons more about caution than fire, yet even he couldn't keep his tone neutral. Jonathan, he began, I see your burden. A good heart can be led astray by compassion. The Lord teaches kindness, yes, but he also teaches wisdom. Folk will not forgive what they don't understand. Jonathan said little. He thanked the Reverend for his concern, offered water for the horse, yet he didn't promise anything. Inside, he found Sora standing still, the children behind her, their eyes wide as if they had heard every word. She lowered her gaze when he looked at her, yet he saw the hurt bloom across her face like a bruise. Life on the homestead pressed forward regardless. Livestock lowed restlessly in their pens. The fields demanded tending, and storms threatened again from the west. Sora worked alongside Emma and Daniel, her hands deft with sewing, her movements sure when stirring a pot or mending a broken hinge. She had the quiet ability to slip into rhythm with the land. As though labor was a language she already knew, Emma grew attached quickly, following her from room to room, mimicking her gestures, asking endless questions about where she came from, what flowers grew in her country, what songs mothers there sang to children. Sora answered, some with soft laughter, some with silence, yet always with patience. Daniel, slower to yield, found himself drawn when one night thunder cracked so sharp it rattled the walls. He had risen with wide eyes, teeth biting his lip, yet Sora had laid a hand on his shoulder and begun to hum. The melody was unfamiliar, lilting, full of sorrow and strength, and he leaned against her without meaning to. The storm passed, yet his guard never quite returned. For Jonathan, the shift was more dangerous. He had lived 7 years with silence as his only companion, raising children on grit and routine, never allowing himself to dream of softness. Yet here was a woman who filled his dwelling not with noise, but with presence. He caught himself watching her too long when she bent over the hearth, when she knelt to tie Emma's ribbon, when her hair slipped loose as she worked in the garden. Each time he forced his eyes away, yet the unease only grew. The community didn't fail to notice. When he rode into town one Saturday with Sora and the cart beside him, a hush spread through the street sharper than gunfire. Men leaned on posts, arms crossed, and women froze mid-step. Children pointed, pulled back by stern hands. Mrs. Whitmore was among the first to speak, her voice cutting like wind through dry stalks. There goes Hartwell parading disgrace like a banner. What's next? Shall we all send for wives across oceans? Jonathan said nothing, yet he felt Sora's shoulders stiffen beside him. He held the reins tighter, jaw locked, carrying her through the storm of stairs as though silence itself were shield enough. That evening, Marcus Brennan reappeared. He swaggered into the tavern, laughing too loud, boasting to anyone who would listen. He called her a trinket, a misguided lot, something he had rejected for his own good sense. The men chuckled nervously, not daring to laugh too long, for even they knew Jonathan Hartwell wasn't someone to provoke. Still, word traveled fast, carried by whiskey and malice. By the next morning, Jonathan had heard enough whispers to know that Brennan meant to humiliate him in public, to turn the community's doubt into ridicule. He found himself walking the fence line that night, the moon shrouded in cloud, the earth soft from recent rain, his thoughts twisted like the barbed wire under his hand. He had promised nothing to this woman. He owed her nothing beyond shelter. And yet the image of her leaving, of Emma's tears, of Daniel's silence, of the dwelling empty, once more gnawed at him like hunger. Inside, she sat by the fire with the children curled against her, her eyes lifting to him when he stepped through the door. There was no plea in her gaze, only a question, quiet and steady. How long would she be permitted to belong here? He couldn't answer. The days ahead stretched taut as wire. Every Sunday at church, every trip into town, every ride along the pasture carried the weight of unseen eyes. Sora bore it with silence. Yet Jonathan could feel the cost in the way she avoided the windows, in the way her smile faltered when gossip carried on the wind. One afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore herself came to the Hartwell homestead, feigning neighborly concern. She stood stiffly at the doorway, her words honeyed and poisoned at once. "It isn't right for your children to be raised in confusion, Jonathan. This woman is no wife, no mother. She'll bring ruin on your name. Let her go before she makes beggars of you all." Sora stood in the shadows, her face pale, yet her back straight. Jonathan said nothing, his silence an iron wall. And Mrs. Whitmore finally turned with a sniff, riding off with satisfaction that her words had been delivered. Yet when he turned, he saw the tears Sora had held back finally slip free. He knew he couldn't let her walk away. He knew also that keeping her would mean war with the very people he called neighbors. As the storm deepened, he looked once more at her sleeping form. The children nestled against her side, and the decision carved itself into him like a scar. The rain outside thickened, pounding like judgment on the roof, and with it came the certainty that the storm within was only beginning. Dawn bled slow across the horizon, pale light stretching itself thin through the mist that clung heavy on the Hartwell homestead. The rain had loosened the soil, leaving the ground soft enough that each step sank with a muted sound, like the earth itself whispering back. Sora rose before the others, her bundle already tied with quiet finality. She moved as though each gesture had been rehearsed in her heart for days, though it had only been spoken aloud the night before. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of leaving something that had begun dangerously, impossibly to feel like home. Yet when she slipped open the dwelling door, she found the children awake, their faces pale in the weak light. Emma clutched her doll so tightly the button seemed ready to pop loose. Daniel stood stiff, jaw set, his fists balled at his sides. Emma stepped forward first, her voice catching in the damp air. "You can't go. You're supposed to stay." Sora knelt, her bundle pressed to her knees. She smoothed Emma's hair, speaking in the careful cadence of someone afraid of breaking fragile glass. I do not wish to bring sorrow to your father. He must not carry my burden. The community does not want me. Daniel's eyes burned, though no tears fell. He had inherited Jonathan's quiet, his stubbornness, and he shook his head sharply. We want you. That's enough. Sora closed her eyes, torn by the impossible divide between belonging and acceptance. When she opened them, she found Jonathan standing in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the gray light behind him. He had heard. His silence filled the room heavier than thunder. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the bundle at her feet. Then, in a voice low yet steady, he spoke. If you leave, they win, and my children lose more than I can give back. Her heart caught at the words. He hadn't said love, not even need, yet the plea was enough to undo the knot she had tied. Slowly, with trembling hands, she untied the bundle. Emma flung her arms around her waist with a relieved sob, and Daniel's stiff posture softened, his hand hovering awkwardly before settling against her shoulder. The decision was sealed in the children's grasp. Though the world beyond would never forgive it, days stretched into weeks. And Sora began to plant herself into the rhythms of the homestead. As though her roots had always been waiting beneath the soil, she tended the hearth with quiet grace, mended shirts with stitches so fine they seemed like care made visible, and leaned her weight against the plow when Jonathan's strength faltered after long hours. She didn't ask permission for these acts. She simply wove herself into the fabric of their life, each gesture a thread binding the hollow edges of the family back together. The children flourished in her presence. Emma learned to braid with deft fingers, her hair adorned with small ribbons Sora cut from worn cloth. Daniel, though slower, began following her into the garden, learning which herbs eased fevers and which roots could be stewed when meat was scarce. At night, she taught them fragments of lullabies from her homeland, the syllables strange yet soothing, songs that spoke of rivers wider than oceans and lanterns that carried wishes into sky. Jonathan watched from the quiet of his chair, his pipe unlit, his eyes following without seeming to. He couldn't deny the change, the way laughter returned to the dwelling, the way light lingered in corners once dim. He felt both relief and fear, as though joy itself were a trespass he couldn't afford. Still, when his hand brushed hers in passing at the table at the barn door, while lifting buckets from the well, he felt a jolt that unsettled him more than any storm. The community, however, didn't soften. Whispers became sharper, turning to open words spoken where they knew he could hear. At the general store, women pulled their children close, muttering of disgrace. At church, pews seemed to shift subtly, space widening around the Hartwell family, as though they carried contagion, Reverend. Patterson preached of keeping one's house in order, his eyes lingering on Jonathan more than once. One Sunday, as they left the church, Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, blocking the path. Her face was tight with satisfaction, her words dripping sweet with venom. You've made your choice, Jonathan, but don't expect the rest of us to embrace what doesn't belong. She'll never be one of us, and the children will bear that mark. Before Jonathan could answer, Sora bowed her head slightly, her voice calm, though it trembled faintly. I do not ask to belong to all, only to those who will let me care for them. The woman sniffed, turned her back, and walked away. Yet Jonathan saw the set of Sora's shoulders, the way her breath caught as if she'd taken a blow. That night he stood beside her at the wash basin, the lantern casting their shadows long on the wall. He didn't touch her, yet his presence beside her, silent and immovable, was an answer she could lean against. Spring deepened, the rains feeding the soil until green rose strong and insistent across the land. Yet storms still threatened, rolling in sudden from the west, thunder cracking the horizon open. One such night, Emma fell ill. Her small body burned with fever, her breath ragged. Jonathan's heart twisted with terror, memory dragging him back to his wife's final illness. He sat by the bedside, his hand clutching Emma's, yet helplessness gnawed at him. Sora took over with quiet command. She brewed a bitter tea from herbs she had gathered, cooled cloths against Emma's skin, whispered prayers in her own tongue. She didn't falter through the long night, her voice steady, even as her own eyes shone with tears she wouldn't let fall. Daniel, frightened, leaned against her, and she held him with one arm while tending Emma with the other, as if her strength was endless. When dawn broke and Emma's fever eased, Jonathan's relief nearly undid him. He sat back, exhausted, and looked at Sora with new eyes. She had not only tended his child, she had pulled his family back from the edge he feared most. In that moment, he realized she was no longer simply a guest beneath his roof. She was the pulse of the home itself. Yet the world outside their door sharpened its gaze. Word spread that Marcus Brennan had been boasting again, mocking Jonathan openly, saying he had taken what Marcus had cast aside. He spoke of Sora as though she were property, claiming he might come for her yet, if only to prove his power. Some laughed, some looked away, yet the poison of his words seeped through the community like rot. Jonathan heard it from a neighbor passing on horseback. The warning wrapped in pity. That evening he found himself pacing the yard as the sun set, fists tight, every muscle drawn taut. He had fought storms, wolves, droughts, yet this was different. This was the cruelty of men, sharpened by pride. And it threatened not just him, but the fragile peace Sora had given back to his children. Sora sensed it too. As she hung laundry beneath the pale light, her eyes lifted off into the horizon, searching as if danger might already be cresting the hills. When Jonathan passed her, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "He will not forgive that I wasn't broken when he cast me away." Jonathan stopped, the words rooting him where he stood. He looked at her then, at the way her hair caught the dying light, at the resilience etched into her every gesture. He wanted to promise her safety, to say she was beyond the reach of any man's scorn. Yet he couldn't shape the words. He only stepped closer, his shadow falling over hers. And in the silence between them, something unspoken tightened like a vow. The days ahead were restless. Neighbors passed by slower, their eyes lingering. Daniel began shadowing his father more closely, as though preparing himself for a threat he couldn't yet name. Emma clung tighter to Sora, asking questions of whether she would stay forever, questions Sora couldn't. The storm carried a fury that felt less like weather and more like judgment. Rain battered the roof in heavy sheets, the windows shuddering against the wind's relentless fists. The dwelling, though sturdy, trembled in the darkness, its lantern light flickering as though it too feared what pressed in from beyond. Jonathan stood near the door, his shoulders square, one hand resting against the rifle that leaned within reach. His gaze was steady, though inside his chest. His heart hammered like hooves on hard ground. Sat near the hearth, with Emma and Daniel pressed against her sides. Emma's eyelids fluttered with the weight of sleep, though fear kept her tethered to wakefulness, while Daniel remained stiff and watchful. Mirroring his father's posture in miniature, the crack of thunder seemed to shake their small bodies. And each time Sora tightened her embrace, murmuring words they didn't understand, but felt. Her voice was soft, unbroken, an anchor in a world unraveling. Through the lightning-slashed window, Jonathan caught sight of shapes moving at the fence line, figures too still to be trees, too deliberate to be shadows. His jaw clenched. Marcus Brennan had come, just as the whispers had promised, and he hadn't come alone. 3 riders dismounted near the gate, their coats dark with rain, their faces glinting with the cruel satisfaction of men who believe themselves in command. The knock came not as courtesy, but as violent fists, pounding against the wood with the rhythm of a threat. The children startled. Emma's small cry muffled against Sora's sleeve. Jonathan didn't flinch. He lifted the rifle and eased the door open just enough to let his presence fill the gap. Rain driving against his chest. Brennan stood there, his grin stretched wide despite the storm. "You've taken what was never yours, Hartwell," he shouted over the wind. "I came to collect what belongs to me." Jonathan's voice was calm, stripped of anything but truth. "You cast her aside. She owes you nothing. You'll find no welcome here." Brennan's laughter cut through the storm like a rusted blade. "You think you can shame me? A woman bought and paid for doesn't choose her fate. Step aside or I'll take her now, and nobody in town will lift a finger to stop me. Behind Jonathan, Sora rose to her feet, still holding the children. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with both fear and defiance. She didn't cower, though her hands trembled against Emma's shoulders. For the first time since stepping from the locomotive, she spoke with a force that cut across the storm. I will not go back. The words struck Brennan harder than any fist. His grin faltered into something uglier, sneer-twisted by rage. He lunged forward, hand reaching for the door, yet Jonathan was already there. With one shove, he forced Brennan back into the mud. The rifle leveled steady. The two men behind Brennan stepped forward, uncertain, the storm catching their hesitation. You'd raise arms over this? Brennan spat, rain streaming from his hair into his eyes. Over a woman not worth your name? Jonathan stepped into the storm fully now, the rain soaking his shirt, plastering it against the muscle and scars of years of labor. His voice was low, yet each word carried the weight of iron. She's worth more than you will ever be. And if you lay another hand toward this door, you'll find the cost dear. For a heartbeat, only the storm answered, thunder rolling like drums across the valley. Brennan's companions shifted, one muttering that this wasn't worth it, that Hartwell's aim was sure. Yet Brennan, drunk on pride, more than whiskey, surged forward again. The struggle that followed was brutal in its simplicity, two men grappling in rain and mud, fist striking, boot slipping. Jonathan fought not with flourish, but with the grim resolve of someone defending the only thing that mattered. Brennan struck wild, snarling. Yet Jonathan's blows landed heavy, deliberate, driving him down into the muck. Sora stood framed in the doorway, the lantern's glow casting her silhouette against the storm. She didn't cry out, didn't plead, only watched with breath caught between terror and awe. Emma clung tighter to her, while Daniel inched closer to the threshold, his small hand gripping the frame as though his presence alone could steady his father. At last Brennan fell, his face bloodied, his pride shattered in the mud. He spat, tried to rise, yet Jonathan stood over him, rifle in hand, the barrel lowered yet ready. Crawl back to your shadows, Jonathan said, his voice ragged with exertion yet unshaken. You'll not darken this door again. Brennan looked up, rain mixing with blood on his face, his eyes burning with humiliation. Yet he saw in Jonathan's stance something immovable, a line no man could cross and live. With a curse choked by defeat, he staggered to his feet and stumbled toward his horse. His companions followed, their silence heavier than any words. Within moments the storm swallowed them,